I would like to start with acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the campus of the ANU, which is on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, paying my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations elders and any First Nations people who may have joined us today. This is land, as is the land you're on, that has known law for millennia. We need to bear that in mind when we talk about law and about compassion, which at heart, I think, is all about interconnected human experience and going beyond this potentially to interconnection with human and non-human experience. But perhaps that's a topic for another day. But that level of wisdom and interconnection is there within First Nations learning, understanding of law as I understand it. So look, I'm going to give an intro to myself, partly so you know who's talking to you, but also because it relates very much to this talk today, which is variously thinking about titles of turning towards suffering, and also I think turning towards suffering and strength. So in some ways, my professional career is one that has led me down that track. And I think that the reality is, whether you're a lawyer or non-lawyer, anyone working within the justice system from any angle, it will be engaging with injustice, experiences of injustice, and that goes hand in hand with engaging with people's suffering. So I'll tell you a bit about me, and then I'll tell you about a parallel journey with mindfulness and compassion meditation, and then I'll move on to talk in more detail about what we can learn from the research on empathy and compassion in particular. So as Anne said, I'm an associate professor here at the ANU College of Law. I'm also a special magistrate and have the great privilege of working with elders in a circle sentencing court in the ACT, which is an experience that I'm happy to talk about if there's time towards the end, but where I sit within or around a circle table with the most incredible, compassionate elders in situations where people are frequently talking about incredible degrees of trauma and abuse, which and experience at the hands of others, but also at the hands of the system itself. And so there is a degree of suffering which I'm familiar with to some extent to a significant extent from my practice career, but that emerges out of what is a safer space within the criminal justice system, the colonial criminal justice system, but one where, given the safety provided by the elders, these stories can emerge, and with that suffering emerges incredible stories of strength in survival and people finding ways by hook or crook to extract themselves with their connections and supports if they have them from that system. But I began really as a third-year law student at the Aboriginal Legal Service in Central Australia, which has its Victorian connections, and that really drew me after first becoming kind of engaged with the criminal justice system through university and thinking about that, and then also Indigenous peoples and law, and really looking at the intersex between the impact of colonialism and colonisation and criminal justice system involvement. That experience drew me back, and so I worked for 4 years in Central Australia as a criminal defence barrister before where I met my wife, who was at that point an Aboriginal field officer, Warramunga Luritja woman, and now an arts curator. And we, after some time there, spent time on the coast raising kids, and then I moved into academia. From academia, I joined the bar and was again a criminal defence lawyer after kind of missing the human engagement. The bar didn't 100% work for me on all sorts of aspects, not least because of its mental health challenges, but also it was a very different dynamic and values connect for me as compared to working at the Aboriginal Legal Service. So that drew me back to the ANU and to academia, I should say, at the ANU, where I've taught in criminal law, evidence law, and have great privilege of taking students out on country and NT for an intensive, which has been a pilot, which we hope to establish as an ongoing annual course. And ultimately in 2021, almost like a full circle, not really a circle, but drawn. I was appointed as a special magistrate, and you can just read casual magistrate for that. But with an appointment which was intended to enable me to work with elders in the circle court and really build that up here. And so that has been a really wonderful values alignment and has enabled me to connect my academic work and commitments with the work that I do in court. Now that has been a journey which I kind of hinted at, with quite a great deal of engagement with suffering with injustice, and not just those that I work with, but in fact my own experiences of that vicariously, and also just due to life circumstances that we all experience from time to time. But thankfully, parallel to that journey was a journey with meditation, particularly mindfulness, and more lately in recent years, perhaps the last 5 to 7 years, a really specific focus on compassion meditation practice. That journey began when I was 21, still at law school. At that point, struggling with chronic fatigue, and that has its own degree of suffering, but for many reasons led into a practice, quite a deep dive, 10 days of silence retreats in the Theravadan Buddhist tradition, which then turned into a lifelong engagement with mindfulness. Now, over the years, that practice developed, and it became clearer and clearer to me that making the compassion aspects, sometimes referred to as the loving kindness aspects of that practice, more present and a greater focus within my own personal practice and within my learning, had the potential to dramatically alter my relationship with myself, but importantly in the context of this, with others, and enabled me to be much more effective in the work that I was doing. So that sort of parallel journey led me to consider the intersections and application of meditation, particularly mindfulness and compassion-based practices. So I want to come to a definition of compassion, talk a little bit about compassion, but then there's really an invitation for you to experientially explore the difference, or even get a taste for the difference between empathy and compassion, and just to investigate with some curiosity whether getting a handle on that difference, a taste for that difference, might enable you to cultivate compassion in a way that enables you to be with the experiences of suffering that no doubt each of you face on a daily or weekly basis, given what I know from Anne about your various locations within the broader justice system. So let's start with a definition, and I'll begin with the Dalai Lama and his definition, and see if this resonates with you and your motivations of compassion. Is a sensitivity to suffering in ourselves and others, with a deep motivation and commitment to alleviate and prevent it. Another definition from a psychologist in a book, Mindful Compassion, that he wrote with another meditator, so Paul Gilbert, and a meditator named Shodan, talks about it and breaks it down a little bit further in ways that I think are helpful. So again, just the question for you, how this resonates with your own psychology. So they break it down to two distinct and interdependent psychologies. And the first of those is a psychology that enables us to be motivated to engage with suffering, to stay with it and understand its causes in a non-judgmental way. And a second psychology that enables us skillfully to work towards the alleviation and prevention of suffering and its causes. And I like this breakdown because it involves both a capacity to turn towards and stay with people's experiences of suffering, but a recognition that we then also need the capacity to work skillfully. And I think in our legal context, this is key. If we're not working skillfully, we may not in fact alleviate it. We might make things worse, or we may not recognize that there are situations where we simply don't have a capacity to have a positive effect, and perhaps not harming is the best we can do in that moment. But it's that aspect, that double aspect, that I hope perhaps sounds familiar to many of you, and is something that you consider essential in the work that you do. I've argued elsewhere with Professor Lorana Bartels that, understood in this way, compassion is really the engine room for therapeutic action, wherever we find it. And so really is the underpinning to therapeutic jurisprudence, amongst other things. In terms of recognizing the centrality and importance of this psychology of compassion, Sharon Roach-Anlou and Kathy Mack, in a 2013 survey of judicial officers, found that 60% of judges, and they surveyed 309, and 70% of the 242 magistrates in the survey considered compassion as either essential or very important. So it's not as if I'm making some unique case. It's the case really being made here is that there's real benefits from getting a more nuanced understanding of compassion, and learning about how it can in fact be cultivated. So I'm going to, it was not for me until I read further into the neuroscience and the studies on compassion training that I really grasped some of two of the key points that I really want to make for you today. So the two takeaways that I want you to explore, if you will, or invite you to. And the first of those is the difference between empathy and compassion. And the second really is that compassion can be cultivated. So it's a trainable skill. You know, it's something that we're not simply born with or not. Obviously, our life experiences and the causes and conditions of our life to this point can render us more or less able to access compassion. But the fact that it's trainable means that if you accept that point, that it's something that we can develop for the benefit of others and for the benefit of ourselves. So coming to that first point, the empathy and compassion and the distinction, in general terms, the distinction is one of a relatively passive state of really engaging with the suffering of others. So feeling into it, that pain of others. And I should say this, that I think when I look back at myself, I was someone who was pretty empathic, and that's what drew me to the practice of law. It was about trying to find a way to use law as a tool to address injustice. And often it's not a great tool, but that was my motivation. And I see that in my students over decades, that many of the best students, in my view, those with these powerful, I'll call them compassionate motivations, are deeply empathic. And it also means that I've seen over time those people struggle because they get into situations where they're faced with suffering and it becomes overwhelming. Empathic overwhelm is something that to a greater or lesser extent is starting to be understood in helping professions. And in my view, at least, law is a helping profession, however we come at it, even if we're lawyers, although you don't see that taught and spoken about very often. But there is a real challenge around empathic overwhelm, which takes us to, in general terms, the difference between compassion, which is something, and I'm not a psychologist, I won't give you any tight definitions here, but it's something that's more than empathy. It's something that has to have empathy within it. It has to involve a capacity to feel the pain of others, but it's more than that. And the more than that can be understood in many ways, but one of those is that there's a real active quality. And it'll make more sense when we get to the neuroscience, and then I'll ask you to explore it. But an active quality, and sometimes you get it referred to as empathy with an action plan. But one of the points I'm inviting you to consider is that, in fact, if we're able to shift our mental engagement, our approach and our mental state from one of simply passively resonating with the pain of others to compassionately engaging with the experience of suffering of others, then that can have very dramatic impacts on our capacity to stay with that and to be effective and not to get burnt out through overwhelm. So I'm just going to give a few other points around compassion that I think are helpful, just a few other quotes, and then we'll get a bit experiential after I speak about some neuroscience studies that I find fascinating, and hopefully you may too. But starting with the point of, well, where does compassion begin? And this idea of compassion as an effective state, so something we can feel in our bodies. And Jennifer Goetz puts it this way, in terms of where compassion begins, with the feeling that arises in witnessing another's suffering and the motivation and that motivates a subsequent desire to help. I particularly like Angela Harris's poetic definition of, or a view of where compassion begins, again with the body. She says, perhaps with the experience of caring. Caring happens in the body in the moment, a quick squirt of oxytocin, a firing of mirror neurons, the sudden perception of a link between the so-called self and the so-called other. And so in one way, that could also equally describe empathic resonance, this mirror neuronal experience where if someone's in pain and we're really tuning into it and feeling it, we're actually going to be feeling that pain. And in fact, as we'll see, the neuroscience shows that lighting up in the pain circuitry of our brains if we're hooked up to a FM functional resonance magnetic imaging and engaging with pain in an empathic way. All right, so more than empathy, let's take a couple of quotes on that, or at least one. Basically, the point here is that compassion must be more than the visceral experience that arises in the face of suffering of those with whom we identify. So there's a real trap here that we may only empathise within our in-group, and that makes compassion something that gets doled out in a discriminatory way and discriminating way. As Joseph Goldstein puts it, and this takes us to the active quality, compassion is not simply a feeling for the pain of others. It also contains within it a strong motivation to act. One of the objections, and I've sort of raised it, but about the risk of compassion being selectively doled out comes from Susan Bandas, Professor Susan Bandas from the US, who's argued that if compassion is understood as a feeling that arises in the face of suffering, then there's a grave risk that compassion may be selectively doled out based on racial bias and class bias, unconscious or otherwise. And that leads to quite neatly to the neuroscientific understandings of compassion and to what Boris Bornman and Tanya Singer is a key figure at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, who's run many studies, and I'll refer to a couple soon, but they argue for a cognitive, affective neuroscience model of compassion, which requires cognitive perspective taking to enable engagement, particularly when the other is so different from ourselves. And basically, they conceptualize compassion as a way of being with attentional, affective, and perspective domains that can be cultivated rather than a fleeting emotional, motivational state. So rather than compassion being something we either do or do not feel, as with an emotion, it's something we can develop so it becomes more of a stable mental disposition or a frame of mind. So let me take you to the studies, which in effect I'm going to invite you to recreate. So one that fascinated me, I love this study, they, in their labs at the Max Planck Institute, they recruited a Buddhist monk, Matthew Ricard. In other contexts have been referred to the happiest man in the world. That's really just a by the by. But what they did is they hooked him up to go into a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine. And they asked him to engage with, to bring to mind the experience of people suffering, whatever came to mind for him, and to just engage empathically with that. So not to practice compassion meditation. We're talking about someone highly adept with compassion meditation and able to essentially switch their mind between being able to engage in different ways. So their instruction was to do this, and they were going to find out what it was like for him to do this, but also watch the imagery. So in he went to the machine. The image he brought to mind, and some of you may recall this, was of Romanian orphans who were all in an enormous room in a news item that was quite that went quite broadly around the world. But essentially, the image there was of a whole lot of orphans and a grossly inadequate number of people to care for them, just crying in their cots with no capacity for any comfort or human touch or connection. So, you know, that's a pretty serious experience that he's bringing to mind. he goes in and he is just engaging with that pain. He comes back out after a time and he says, that essentially his experience is one of extreme overwhelm. I could barely kind of keep it together as he continued to hold that image in mind and essentially feel into the pain that was being experienced. So they sent him back in, and now the instruction was to bring in. Oh, and so from a third-person perspective, what they saw on the imaging machine was all of the pain circuitry in his mind lighting up. So basically, he was experiencing pain from his first-person perspective, and the machines told us that he was experiencing pain. So they then sent him back in and asked him to now bring online his compassion meditation practice. So same images, but engaging with the practice. And essentially this was to engage with an active wish for the well-being of these children. Now, note here, he didn't have an actual capacity to change their experience. It was an image arising of suffering that he had no actual active capacity to change. But they asked him to bring on his compassion practice, which essentially stimulates or the understanding that meditators had, that neuroscience was testing, is that essentially it stimulated a different part of the mind or the brain, the capacity, and switched on the care circuitry, which is different and distinct from the pain circuitry, if you like. So he went in, did this, came out and reported that what he felt for these children was just enormous love, and he was able to stay with those images and express this love silently in his mind to them. And there was not that quality of overwhelm. In fact, there was a quality of warmth towards them. What they saw on the third person perspective was, as I've indicated, different parts of the brain lighting up, parts of the brain associated more with a warm caring aspect of human experience. So quite dramatic. Now, we might say, well, that's a Buddhist monk, happiest man in the world. What's the point of that? For us, we work in the justice system. We've got no time to develop that sort of capacity. Well, yep, fair call. But the studies are fascinating, and it's still probably early days. But they did a study of novice meditators, and real novices. They had never undertaken meditation or compassion training. They asked them to view images of people in pain, and they did a similar test to check what was going on. And yes, they found mirror neuronal experiences of pain. They then had them train for only 6 hours of compassion meditation training and asked them to again engage with the same images, and they reported, and the third person perspective was of an increased positive affective experience. So a greater capacity to stay with those images, not turn away, not flinch, but be warm with that active quality of wishing well. Now, you might also then question and be cynical about, well, if this is just about protecting me so I don't get overwhelmed, how aren't we actually interested here in whether or not it motivates us or gives us the capacity to be more compassionate? And so it's pleasing to know, and again, these are early days on studies, but another study showed increases in altruistic behaviour after 2 weeks of compassion training. So the idea that you're providing a platform, it feels more possible for the person with that training to be with suffering, but it also provides a greater motivation to act, to alleviate it where that's possible. And I just want to say it's not always possible for people, or easily possible, except perhaps in small ways, which are critical for many within the justice system to alleviate suffering in every instance, given in particular that the system itself creates a great deal of suffering, and many of us are wittingly or unwittingly participants in that, and that can be a very painful experience. So then let me now invite you with a bit of a warning, but I think it's a warning that, from what I know from Anne, all of you do engage on a daily or weekly basis with people within the system who are experiencing suffering. I'm going to invite you to join with me to, in a sense, recreate this exploration of engaging empathically, and then by bringing in an aspirational wish. So your screens are off if they're not, inviting you to turn them off so you don't feel like your face will be observed. I'll stay here with my face there. There's no need to, you can close your eyes or not. It's really a matter for you, whatever's comfortable. And if you don't want to participate, then by all means, just don't engage. It might take us about between 5 and 10 minutes, probably in the midpoint. And big thanks to one of my favourite meditation teachers, Jeff Warren, who's taught me a version of this exploration of the difference between empathy and compassion. Okay, so wherever you are, in whatever position, just inviting you to take a moment to stretch up your spine on an in-breath and to settle in on an out-breath. And if it's helpful to you, just to take a few deep and deliberate breaths as a way of settling into the body. And inviting you to just allow the breath to settle into whatever rhythm it finds itself in. And we're going to start by just finding an anchor in our experience, somewhere to direct our attention. And the invitation here is to use the breath. So just the breath as it is, wherever the experience of breathing is strongest for you. So that might be in the area of the abdomen or the chest, the expansion and contraction. Might be the flow of air coming in and out of the nostrils. Might be a sense of the whole body breathing. And you can always anchor your attention elsewhere, perhaps in the hands or feet or points of contact with the chair or the floor. Just somewhere that's comfortable for you. And we'll just follow one breath. And each time the mind wanders, just bringing it back to the next breath. It's this breath, this experience. And so now just to explore, get a taste for the experiential difference between empathy and compassion, I'm going to invite you to engage in a visualization. Using imagination and then tuning in as best we can to the experience that might arise in the body. So the invitation for you now is to bring to mind a person you know who's experienced suffering. And maybe someone that's been in a courtroom you've been in or within a justice process in the last week or so, someone who's still in that process. Or if nobody comes to mind, you can choose someone outside the system, or even a generic example from the news. There's a depressing number of these. So just bringing to mind that person and just taking a moment to feel into their experience. And obviously this is a manufactured experience. It'd be much more intense if we're actually there engaging with somebody. Just doing our best to get a sense of their experience. Might be fear, loneliness, isolation, heartbreak. And just noticing in those areas that might be familiar to you where emotion arises, just noticing what's there for you. Is anything arising at all? Might be in the area of the throat or chest or abdomen. Just taking another moment or two. Okay, now inviting you to let go of that visualization and come back to your anchor, your home base. So this may be the breath or wherever you were focusing your attention before. And just letting that experience pass or linger. Just letting it be and focusing your attention on the breath. And so now we're going to bring in a practice of compassion. And this is generally done by the silent repetition of words or phrases, which we speak silently, doing our best to connect with an aspiration for the person's well-being. So I'm going to use some pretty standard phrases, but the person you brought to mind or will bring to mind, there may be particular phrases that are meaningful for that context. And so go ahead and use those. All right, so now inviting you to bring to mind the same person going through an experience of suffering. And you can either then repeat after me or come up with your own phrases, again, silently in your mind. May you be safe. May you be peaceful. May you live in harmony. May you live with ease. So you're gathering your attention behind your words, your phrases. You're connecting as best you can with an image of the person and their experience, together with an aspiration for their well-being. May you be safe. May you be peaceful. May you live in harmony. May you live with ease. Now, we're not looking for any extraordinary experience to arise here. Many people's expression of compassion is very calm and warm, so not overly emotional. And nothing may be arising. There may be no sense of contrast here. And we're just exploring the possibility of contrast. Okay, so now letting go of that practice and coming back to your home base, your breath, or wherever your attention was focused at the beginning, just letting that settle. Okay, so we'll end the session and invite you to come back into the Zoom room, so to speak. You can turn your cameras back on if they've been off and you want to have them on. We'll leave them off, matter for you. Now, ideally, this would be an opportunity for me to put people into breakout groups and just to explore in a smaller group setting, whether or not there was anything that arose, just acknowledging that maybe the contrast wasn't there for you, and that's perfectly fine. But just to get an opportunity for you to speak and hear from others about their experience. Given the time, given the setting, I might just ask for a show of virtual hands to see whether any, and perhaps nobody, perhaps many of you, experienced a difference in your affective experience, so what you felt as you engaged empathically, and then explored the idea of engaging compassionately. So if you did find a difference with that condition, either a thumb or a hand, just pop it up on the screen electronically, or raise it if you've got your, whatever works for you. I just want to get a sense of if that landed for anyone. Okay. And if it didn't, that's totally understandable. As I said, it's really artificial in a lot of ways, but it's really an invitation here to just explore and understand that that there may be a real benefit from understanding the difference here between mindfulness and compassion. And I think that we will just move to questions with really only one point that I want to make before we close. When we talk about compassion, a key aspect, and this is in the Dalai Lama's definition, but in all, is that it has to be also about self-compassion. And as Kristen Neff puts it, and she is perhaps one of the best known authors in the self-compassion space from a psychological perspective, is that really to draw a distinction between self-compassion and compassion for others is to really miss a lot of the deeper understanding, and to draw a distinction between self and others, which ultimately misrepresents our essential interconnectedness. And so from that understanding, it's just about which direction you're directing that compassion. It can be directed in, it can be directed out. And the benefits of learning a self-compassion and compassion practice can be quite extraordinary, particularly for those who've come not out of health professions where perhaps there's a better literacy for this sort of self-care work than out of the legal professional setting on law schools, where there's often no literacy or understanding for self-care. And therefore, we take it as our fault when we experience empathic overwhelm, and we look for the standard ways of dealing with it, many of which are familiar to me and others, such as alcohol as a classic, for example. Now, so I'll throw to questions now. I'm just looking. Here we go, and I can go with what's on. You can use the chat. So, first one: what advice can you give around making a common practice of developing compassion as an individual level or an organisational level? How do large organisations go about embracing it with regards to their customers? Yeah, that's such a good question. And I work with a meditation teacher in Canberra who, and we have tried to offer mindfulness and compassion into various justice settings, and they sometimes work well, they sometimes don't. They're really tricky because people kind of feel compelled into it, and then it doesn't work, and yet it's challenging. And often my experience working with law firms and others is that the more successful ones, it's set from the top, so the leaders within that kind of really make it clear that this is something they care about, and it's part of them showing compassion to their workforce. And they're also prepared to do the hard work. So there's an aspect of saying, yeah, well, I can speak from my own experience. But on a functional level too, I think from the experience, and we ran a course with the DPP, in-house at the DPP, really, really kind of challenging. Not without its merits, but really difficult within the hubbub of the to-do lists and then crazy trials that are going on. But also had experience with law firms that have brought their firm out to a space where meditation takes place, like a local hall or a place which is away from the workplace to give things the space. And that seems to me, but it's just my view, to have been effective. But yeah, I think I think there are examples around the world of whole organisations which have set these sort of practices within their professional setting, but it's an ongoing challenge, and it's probably the sort of one where an organisation might best profit from working with an expert in the field who might offer those services. But that said, there can be all sorts of organic developments, just smaller groups within an organisation agreeing to work with an app, for example, or sharing an app and then sharing their experience around it. So there's plenty that's out there. So hopefully that was some answer. My experience is that the mind is a powerful tool that can manifest and transfer positive outcomes with the correct guidance. Great. So yeah, just great comment. What do you see as the relationship between compassion and trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed organisations? That's such an important question, and I think it's absolutely fundamental. So, and I think this goes with mindfulness and compassion. I think vicarious trauma is another way of thinking about this, that we're engaging day in, day out with people suffering. We want to stay open to it, but it hurts. And just to give you an example, it's a daily thing for me in the Circle Court, and I feel deeply privileged to be there with the stories. But the reality is that the emotion and staying there has its impact, and having a long-standing meditation practice, I'm perhaps more alive to it. I can feel my whole body contracting often, or the end of the day, I'm really holding a lot of stuff. When things are working well and I'm more kind of mindful and able to be with that experience, what the typical thing seems to be is that the emotions can kind of flood through, and they're intense and they're experienced intensely, but then they flow out. And I mean, if you've watched any videos of the Dalai Lama or anything, the way he engages, and this is really just my conjecture, I mean, he's just so open and flowing with emotional experience that he can go from crying to laughing almost in a split second. Because what happens with these emotions is that they come in and then they turn into thought loops and they link around, and we can't let them go at night and so on. And I'm not saying I'm an expert on this. I had a really traumatic case last week that just hit hard, because it was a young 22-year-old woman with an enormous degree of trauma, who then got arrested after opening up after a Circle Court process for a separate offence in the past, and felt that the whole system had sort of conspired against her, brought back in for a bail application back before me as a blubbering mess, with everyone just feeling like this was an example of the damage of the system. And, you know, that really stayed. Just one example, but some stick, some don't. But having a practice around that, I think, is powerful. And so, yeah, I think thinking about mindfulness and compassion practices within trauma-informed organisations, super important. The other thing that I'd like to say, though, is that you can't just, like, there are limits. So if you're just kind of saying, oh, well, we just need this practice of mindfulness and compassion and we can handle everything. Well, no, there are structural issues here. And so there are also many aspects where, you know, a practice where your emotions are really overwhelming, if there isn't capacities to debrief, for example, and work with professionals around that, to debrief within an organisation, to just step out, speak to friends, have that space, or go for a walk, they may be the strategies that are important. So I think it's holistic, with things like mindfulness and compassion practices being things that can really add to our emotional literacy, because the emotions are there regardless, and we're in the thick of it. So yeah, now allowing the person the space to speak without interruption. Yeah, for sure. Try to use it in my talking and conflict circles at the beginning. Sometimes clients think I'm nuts, but it seems to work. Yeah, there's a whole lot of work which is awesome about a compassionate pause. I don't know if people have been on to it. I'm aware from others. It's kind of weird, but it's like, it makes sense. It's like, stop, quieten down, because we're all overloaded. And then people come at engagement with one another from a space of presence, like being in the moment, and the capacity that has to impact what then comes from the moment, I think is just extraordinary. So thanks for that contribution, Anita. And do we need to teach compassion as part of how we train our legal professionals? Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think one of the things I taught a class in the medical school here, and, you know, they've got the Hippocratic Oath, and part of it is you've got to take care of yourself, and we don't even have that. There's an oath that law students now take, thanks to a graduate law student at ANU, about looking after well-being. But, you know, and we teach to some extent, but no, long way to go. And I think one of the issues around this is that from the law, we lose an enormous number of wonderful, empathic, and potentially, well, compassionate, but perhaps without that enhanced capacity students, because those that survive within the crushing system are those that develop a capacity to switch off, which is, you know, very sad, very sad. So, you know, I think it behooves all of us within the profession at every angle to think about, well, how do we support people who come to law to help, or to law and justice and experience to help not to burn out, to see that they have fellow travellers with them as well that can be part of that support. Social workers are taught to engage, without gut feelings and really consider why we feel that way. Yeah, I mean, that's right. There's so much from other, and I think this is the TJ thing, and this might come up in the next question, but the idea that, working cross-disciplinary ways and learning, having lawyers, for example, work with psychologists, or in a First Nations context, really having people engaging there, being able to and to really deeply respectfully work with First Nations people, so that they can get an experience of or an understanding and a capacity to operate in the context of things like intergenerational trauma. As Kylie says, in the TJ area, we're often dealing with heavy situations. We're straight into another demand, then another. It is usually out of the workplace that we need to then work on ourselves. Yeah, that is a reality. I think structurally, perhaps in law, there just isn't that premium or that understanding put in that it needs to be ideally structured into the workplace, so it's not just left to individual people to find their way within it. Monash is doing a fantastic job with medical students, and in fact, I can't remember the name of the practitioner that leads that and the professor, but they've got all sorts of courses that are really, really wonderful. So, there are capacities for professional organisations to work in with existing projects. Should the courts and law embrace a customer client service charter that calls out compassion as one area of focus? Yeah, I think I've made arguments elsewhere. I think it's worth talking about it. And I think consider this really is what this is all about, this forum. And I suppose what I'm suggesting is that the thing to consider from this is that speaking about compassion as a core value and capacity and a trainable skill is something that can have wide benefits personally and systemically. And ultimately, things like therapeutic jurisprudence are often kind of like individual actions of, someone working within the justice system. The metaphor is often the wine within the bottle. But ultimately, both with therapeutic jurisprudence and compassion, we need to be thinking about compassionate system design, so that there is the space. We're not forcing people through in ways that are clearly contrary to any kind of compassionate engagement. Because as we push people through that and exacerbate their suffering, those of us that participate in that are also suffering along, because we're alive to it, even if we would like to shut it down somewhere deep and it just comes out exploding in us later on. The law and legal training seems to see emotions as less than or distracting to logic, rather than valuing compassion, emotional intelligence as part of making better decisions. It so totally does. And I think one of the key themes coming from the conference on the weekend was the importance of the head and the heart working together. And so that both in terms of overarching design, but also just in terms of decision making. And for the other point, I suppose, that arises from what Sophie has just said there is, it's an absolute furphy that we can think that emotions don't impact our decisions. We could pretend they don't, and so be not emotion aware, but they will. It's like unconscious bias. We won't know. That's the whole point. It's unconscious. So unless we're seeking to engage with it, make it conscious and accept that, for example, all of us will be operating with racist biases depending on our enculturation and so forth, then we're not able to be part of the solution. And I think just accepting that emotional intelligence is critical, but is also that emotions are going to be part of the picture no matter what, leads to us having the capacity to be more emotion aware and potentially to bring compassion online in ways that don't interfere with, for example, a role that involves a significant degree of impartiality, how we want to understand what that means. We're in relationship with one another in this justice system in every different way. And to pretend that we're not, I think, becomes really counter-therapeutic. And so it's that broader, and this is, I think, Susan Bandis's point, though, if compassion is only to an in-group, then we've totally missed the point. It's got to be something that we grow. It's not a zero-sum game. I'm compassionate to you with your offence, but not you. You're somehow evil. That's not a fully realised understanding in any way. And it's not about pity. And it's not about being lenient or light or whatever it is. It's about a capacity to be with, to understand that experience, and therefore make, back to Sophie's kind of point, be in a position to be more rational about what's going to work in a particular context. My absolute pleasure. Thanks to all of you, and good luck in all the work that you do.